Hey everyone, and welcome to another Konoha Reviews. Today we will talk about the classic first-person shooter Halo 2, the follow-up to the massive hit Halo Combat Evolved. Now this game became a huge hit as well in terms of sales, but in terms of critical success, there were actually plenty of people who thought that the game was hit and miss, especially considering the campaign. I fondly remember when this game was released. I even remember the exact date, as it was 11th of November 2005, because the 11th of November is a special festive day in Holland, and I remember playing this particularly during that. I spent so much time with my friends playing the awesome maps in multiplayer with Xbox Live, and also tackled the campaign multiple times either by myself or in split-screen co-op. Now I too back in the day had some gripes with the campaign, but they must have watered out over time, because for the past few years I always mentioned that it was Halo 2 that was my favorite in the franchise. But in reality, what I have come to find is that this specific phrase is based on the first 3 levels rather than the entire campaign, and as I revisited the campaign with the Anniversary Edition that comes with the Master Chief Collection, I also did rediscover some of the points that I thought were indeed a bit less. But before we jump into the deep end, let's take a step back and see what Halo 2 is all about. It would be 4 years after the success of Halo Combat Evolved before we were going to get Halo 2, and thus the hype and anticipation was out of this world. I kinda miss the hype that games had back in those days, because you were waiting for so long and really were dependent on information through magazines or TV shows rather than the internet, where nowadays studios like Ubisoft bombard you with so much footage before the game is even launched that I feel like I've experienced the game before even having played it. I still remember the E3 trailer of Halo 2 back from 2003 and how epic and insane it looked. It promised a war on consoles of an unseen scale in a huge city on fire, with new gameplay elements showcased every other minute. Unfortunately though, the footage that was shown never made it into the game and was actually too powerful for the actual Xbox, and thus there's a level in the game that kinda represents this E3 demo, but it's downscaled by a tenfold of how it was shown. The end result is still pretty cool, but comes nowhere close to what we saw during the E3 trailer. Anyway, 2 years later, Halo 2 finally saw the light of day, and we could finally have the battles on Earth against the Covenant like the commercial campaigns had promised. After surviving the massive ring in the first Halo, Master Chief was back on Earth, but would soon find himself reaching for a weapon again as the Covenant were attacking humans' first home. Now there was actually something at stake here. It was no longer a battle on an alien artifact or planet, but now it was on ours. It was our very own existence that we were trying to protect from the invader, and this premise, though maybe not super original, still stands as a house even to this day. Sections where you need to defend the Earth from a large alien invasion are almost always done awesome in games, as Mass Effect 3 had such an amazing intro as well, with Earth coming under attack. The same goes for Halo 2. Unfortunately though, Halo 2 is not really about the war for Earth. They held onto that for Halo 3, and is part of what I thought was a bit of a mistake with the Halo 2 campaign. But we will get there in a moment, because let's first talk about those intro levels, which are the best part of Halo 2 by a long mile. With the Anniversary Edition, you can once again swap on the fly between the graphics of the old game and the new remade graphics. Halo 2 came out during the last year of the Xbox, and so showcased all of the power that a console had to offer, and in my opinion, the game still looks quite good. It also is impressive that quite a lot of items and objects are physics-based, and so they would fly all over the place because of a grenade, or you could punch them over. For a 2005 console title that looked this good, that was quite an achievement. Probably the least impressive are the character models. They are much better than compared to Combat Evolved. But the models of, for example, the Covenant are really good and detailed, and certain spots on Delta Halo, or the Covenant home, can still look very impressive, though maybe a bit flat in terms of color. The irony of it all is that I actually prefer the 2D background of the first level in the old graphics over the new one, because it's less dark. The new graphics are of course as expected very pretty, and add more details like dynamic lighting and shadows. Skyboxes are way more impressive, like the new Mombasa level feels even more epic with flak shown in the sky, or Delta Halo feeling greener than ever with lush vegetation. Or the Covenant home now actually conveys that there's a giant city in the background, whereas the older game depicts that very lousy. The irony in it all is that you can still see its age because of all the animations are exactly the same as the old game, and so for example a marine walking up a flight of stairs does indeed look like an animation from 2005 and not current gen. But the most noteworthy thing with the anniversary is not the graphics in my opinion, but the redone sound design. All the voice lines, weapon sounds, but also music are remastered, and it is one heck of an improvement compared to the first one. Voice lines are much more crisp and clear. The music cues are better to hear and sometimes way more atmospheric than the original, and the weapons and explosions are just a feast for the ear as they really pack a punch now, and I could not stop noticing how much each little sound detail was improved. From the engine sound of a warthog to a pistol being fired to a banshee or ghost shooting at my position. I will say though that some songs from the original were entirely changed into other songs rather than a remaster, and that is my only gripe that I have with the music. There's for example a very famous part during the level where the Covenant Civil War breaks out, where Master Chief walks into a room where hunters and elites are fighting brutes, and this awesome instrumental track Blow Me Away from Breaking Benjamin slams you right in the face and makes you want to partake in this huge battle royale despite Cortana advising you to sit this one out. Probably because of copyright reasons they had to use a new song for the remake, but luckily the original track is still in there if you switch to the old graphics, so that, in my opinion, is the only area that is an absolute must-play in the old style. It is that good. Also, a point of critique I have with this, which might surprise you, is that I'm not a big fan of the style of the new cutscenes. Though they might look more cinematic compared to the old ones, the color contrast is so incredibly strong that everything looks way darker to the point where I kinda hated that look. The cutscenes are sometimes so starkly contrasted that scenes feel smaller in scale compared to the original. There's a lot of color loss, and though the animations and everything are indeed improved upon, I still have to say that I prefer the cutscenes of the old game. They just convey much better what is happening because there's color, the characters are clearly framed, and you can actually see what is going on. But let's get back to some positive notes, and I can assure you that I'm very positive about the first 3 levels of this game, to the point where I say that this might be the best levels in all of the Halo franchise. The build-up is perfect in terms of scale, but also introducing new gameplay elements to the player. You start out on a space station as the Covenant attack Earth, and thus the first level is once again in these corridors, but much more varied and lively compared to the first game. Already new gameplay mechanics get introduced, like being able to dual-wield weapons like pistols or SMGs, something that was huge for back in the day. You could also, for example, head towards a friendly NPC and switch weapons with them if you wanted that specific gun that they had, or wanted to give them a weapon so they could use it indefinitely since they don't run out of ammo. Making the NPCs more useful in this sense was another gameplay mechanic that it greatly improved upon, and Halo 2 really came out in a time when the shooter genre was still being able to evolve. Shooters, in reality, have stopped evolving for several years, since pretty much all shooters share elements with each other without one doing something drastically new. But gameplay mechanics, like being able to dual wield, being able to give or take weapons from NPCs, hijacking a driving or flying vehicle, using melee weapons, or letting the friendly AI drive while you are in the back and shoot, were all things that were brand new and rarely done in other games beforehand. There was room for improvement, and Halo 2 really took that and showcased this evolution. Nowadays, no one is surprised when one can dual wield in a shooter, but back in that day, it was something really awesome, only being done by a handful of games like Perfect Dark and Time Splitters. So the first level is awesome, and also has some really cool sections that take place outside in space for a moment, where the sound is muffled and you fight elites with jetpacks. Once you are done with this awesome level, you descend down to Earth and fight in the streets of New Mombasa, and these 2 levels are also pure perfection. The overall skill is epic as you hear a huge war being fought in the background and ships flying over in the sky, avoiding flak while hunting enemies. In these levels, you are also constantly accompanied by friendly NPCs, which add to that epic war feeling that I find so awesome in games. The urban environments also help, since you fight from street to street and building to building in a level and setting that feels very alive. Along the way, you will meet up with other Marines who are set up at a hotel where they take care of the wounded, and you really feel like you are all in this together and everyone is doing their part. The final area of this level is in a Warthog, and as I said earlier, you can choose here to either drive yourself, like you always do, or take control of the back turret while one of the AI drives for you. This makes it to where the game becomes a shooter on rails for a moment, but the cool thing is that all the driving is done unscripted and in real time, meaning though it might feel on rails, it will be different each time you play it. Now the AI is definitely not perfect when it comes to driving, and will often bump into things or might not take the most efficient route. But I know that there are people who say that the driving AI is really trash, but in my honest opinion, I was quite surprised how capable they were. I played through this final section all the way only as the turret gunner, and the driver AI actually got me all the way through to the end. There were a couple of times where it bumped into an object and had to back out to reposition itself, but the fact that this AI could do this whole route while I was shooting was incredibly impressive to me. Many developers nowadays are still not confident enough in their AI to have them do the driving, so absolute props for Halo 2 for doing this. It should also be mentioned that the levels in Halo 2 are a lot smaller and more linear compared to Halo Combat Evolved, but in my opinion, they are a bit more streamlined and varied. There are still sections like the Warthog sections during the first levels, where the areas are a bit wider to give room to drive, but it never reaches Silent Cartographer levels of amazing openness. In a way, every Halo game has something that's the best in. Halo Combat Evolved has still the best level overall, with the fourth one. Halo 2 has the best first act, and overall war vibe in a giant city, and yes, I find it even better than it is in Reach, though Halo Reach also has some amazing and awesome urban combat sections. It's just that by the time that Reach came out, games like the later Call of Duties had already given us way bigger set pieces, and by the time Halo 2 came out, that was not the case. I also think that Halo 2 has the best story of all the Halo games, but we will get to that in a bit. So the third mission has you command the mighty Scorpion tank, as you have this awesome section over a giant bridge, and it ends with a great segment where you jump onto a Covenant walker and take it out from the inside. Once again, there are these awesome moments as Warthogs race down the streets battling enemies in their armor, everyone screaming and swerving around each other, and it was epic back then and still feels epic now, even though admittedly not as much is happening on your screen compared to other modern shooters. But then the game does something, and in my opinion, it takes a step for the worse. So where I believed that the whole game would be around trying to save Earth, the matter of the fact is that this was not true. The main Covenant ship jumps to light speed, and a single human ship enters the space rupture as well as they arrive at Delta Halo, another ring. But before you get to play that section, the game does a 180 and has you play as a different character. You see, ever since the first cutscene, various points of view from the Covenant were presented as the leading elite who was responsible for the campaign on the first Halo is being brought to justice and punished for his failure. Instead of being executed, he gets turned into the Arbiter, an elite soldier that is being sent on suicide missions. As mentioned before, I think that Halo 2's story is the best out of all the Halo games because it adds so much depth to both the UNSC but also the Covenant that does not seem far-fetched. Historic significant things get mentioned like the taming of the Hunters, the Grunt Rebellion, and more, implying that this covenant of all these different races really occurred in steps over a long period of time. The showcase of the hierarchy of the Covenant with the three hierarchs, Truth, Mercy, and Regret at the upper top, each with drastically different personalities and agendas. The Arbiter is also excellently voiced by Keith David, and overall, getting to know more about the Covenant is fascinating as they see the Halo rings as these religious artifacts crucial for their journey to salvation. The undertone of the story in and of itself is very much about religion, the abuse of its leaders, and the blindness it can create in those who follow it without questioning anything. But it luckily does not turn into a story or motive where the game is trying to send a clear message or berate you for telling you that religion is bad, unlike something ham-fisted like the religious undertone in Starship Troopers 3. It is also here that you discover that you play as an elite, and I remember being very surprised when I was a kid and played this for the first time. But it was a welcome twist since now you were fighting alongside the Covenant with the elites and the cute little grunts being your friends. It now also felt better to use some of the Covenant weapons since I preferred the UNSC weapons in the older Halo, but now would prefer to roleplay as the Arbiter a bit, and mostly, if not only, use Covenant rifles and guns. But as I said earlier, it is here where the game takes a step for the worse, and that is because many of the levels you play as the Arbiter are, in my opinion, very ugly and boring. The first level has you breach a base in search of a heretic leader, and it gives you flashbacks to the weaker levels from the first Halo as you walk through the same grey hallways over and over again, fighting robots, heretic Covenant, and lo and behold, the Flood again. There's a short flying section with a Banshee, but aside from the cool music from the old game, it's also not that thrilling, since it's just you and the Phantom moving from platform to platform, and not a big fight in the sky between many different ships. The next level is more of the same, with more grey hallways and this god-awful section with an elevator that descends at the slowest pace, while sometimes nothing is happening for long periods on end. When I played it first recently, I thought maybe I had it bugged or glitched something out where no new enemies spawned after killing the first few waves as the elevator descends. But then I played it again in co-op on a higher difficulty, and the same boring section played out the same to the point where I just started punching boxes up the elevator to keep myself entertained. After the second Arbiter level, you switch over to the Master Chief again, but later you will have 4 more Arbiter levels and 2 of them are still pretty bad, though one is clearly a lot worse than the other. The third Arbiter level is again more grey corridors and hallways, and the fourth at least offers some more variety as you battle in the snow through areas that are wide enough to where you and your fellow elites can use vehicles to battle against the enemies. But even this level is still pretty dark and grey looking. It's not until the final 2 levels of the Arbiter that it becomes awesome again, and not only the level looks cool, but also the context, as the Civil War has pitted the elites, grunts, and hunters against the brutes, jackals, and others who follow. The first time I got to the end section, where 2 hunters are not trying to kill me, but are actually helping me, was a nerdgasm moment for sure. The Master Chief levels, on the other hand, are pretty much all still very cool. The Delta Halo levels are amazing, though as mentioned, not as open as the old Halo game. But the green valleys and ancient ruins look absolutely gorgeous, and accompanied by some of the best music the game has to offer, it's a magnificent section that sticks with you. It's a shame still that the game did not stick to Earth, as you now only have a small UNSC force battling here, but returning to Halo once more felt like coming home and getting into a nice comfortable bath. It's also moments after these levels where you meet the leader of the Covenant, which adds even more depth and layers to the story of Halo 2, as you are now face to face with the reason the Halo rings exist in the first place. I will say here that the design of the Gravemind in the old game is a bit weird and blurry, but in the new cutscene it's way more impressive, so I will admit here that this particular cutscene I do prefer the newer one over the old one. Then the final 2 levels of Chief have you visit the home Covenant base as you try to escape and take out the Hierarchs. The cool thing here is that everything adheres to the same purple motives you are used to from the Covenant ship level in the first game, but it does not feel nearly as repetitive or recycled. You head to different rooms that clearly have different purposes. Some are breeding dens for the insect-like drones, and others are recreational rooms or gardens. It feels awesome, and the level in and of itself reveals even more about the Covenant and their way of life. The background story of the brutes and the elites clashing with each other, as the torch of being the honor guard is changed, is also awesome, and having to face the brutes as a new enemy is a welcome one. For Chief, unfortunately, there's no real climax or end boss he needs to face, and instead, it's the Arbiter that gets the last level where a proper final boss battle against Tartarus is kinda okay. Tartarus has a shield which makes him invulnerable, and so you have to wait until it's down so you can damage him. The problem with this is that instead of fighting him when his shield is up, you are just waiting and jumping around to avoid his swings until you have the opportunity to damage him. It would have been better if actively participating in the battle from the beginning would not be a waste. And then there is the infamous ending, and the thing most critics back in the day felt bad about. As the entire Covenant fleet jumps back to Earth, ready to destroy it once and for all, the Master Chief is picked up on radar, and he's on the capital ship, and when asked what he is doing on there, he simply answers with, "finishing this fight," and then the game ends. Talk about a stupid cliffhanger without a proper climax for Chief, and a big letdown for anyone hoping for a good conclusion. Nowadays, this ending might not have the same impact, since Halo 3 is out and ready, and you can simply head on over to that game once you are done with Halo 2. But back in the day, you knew you had to wait at least 2 or 3 more years before you would actually be finishing this fight. I do remember not hating the ending that much, as I did think it was cool that we were going to fight on Earth again, but I just wished, even back then, that more of Halo 2 would be about fighting for Earth. As I said, the first 3 levels of Halo 2 are of such an amazing quality that the thought of those levels alone made me believe that Halo 2 was my favorite. It also has the deepest and best story in the entire Halo franchise in my opinion, and does something amazing new improvements over the old game, including dual wielding, melee weapons, AI that drive vehicles, and more. The switch to the Arbiter was also cool, but many of the levels you get to play as him are very lackluster and quite boring. I really think it's the first 3 to 4 Arbiter sections that pull the campaign down for me, as the Chief levels are still very cool and engaging. The levels themselves might be less open, but are still very well made, more varied, and luckily don't recycle as much as the old Halo did. Replaying this game now, after more than a decade, made me revisit all that fun and joy I had with this game for years. But I do have to admit that the experience was a bit less than I expected since, as I said, in my mind, this Halo was my favorite of them all, and by now, I'm not so sure. Maybe I actually like Halo 3 the most after all. We shall see. In the end though, I put this next to Halo 1 and had to ask myself which I like more. Halo 2 does a lot of steps up compared to the first Halo, but also takes some steps back. But I do realize that no section in Halo 2 ever gets as bad as the library level in the first Halo, or the recycled levels at the end of Combat Evolved is not something they do here, which is great. And paired with the amount of gameplay improvements and the new things introduced, I can wholeheartedly say that yes, I do prefer Halo 2 over Halo Combat Evolved, but not as much as I thought I would. In the end, Halo 2 gets an 8.3. I believe I gave Halo Reach the same score, so I'm very curious what Halo 3 will do. Many of my friends actually hold Halo 3 as their main favorite, so maybe when I revisit that game, I might fall in love with it once more. Or Halo ODST, which offers so much more of that urban combat I love so much. Only time will tell, as in the near future, we will have more Halo reviews on this channel.